Do funds look for raw data, semi-processed data, signals, analytics, reports? In your experience, do funds look for all of those or some of those?
We think they look for all three. It really depends on the type of fund, but we think that there is definitely demand for raw data sets, processed data sets or signals, and sort of visualizations or reports around that data. And as a result, we sort of have products for all three of those. You know, we went in initially starting with a signal-based product. Our background is as quantitative analysts and for alpha generation. So we built a number of signal-based products, and we initially thought that the target audience would be sort of a mid-sized firm, maybe someone with who would be willing to outsource potentially some of the research. We think of ourselves as more a research firm than a data provider. And our view is that a mid-sized firm would basically have potentially the resources to purchase something like this, but maybe not the resources to do a lot of research on raw data themselves, so they'd be more willing to outsource some of this work effectively. We were pleasantly surprised that we were wrong. It turns out that we were able to acquire as clients some of the very largest and more sophisticated quant firms on the street. We actually had a quote from one of the directors of research at one of these top quant firms who said to us, "We don't have a monopoly on innovation. So if we think that there's something interesting that someone's doing and we can believe in the research that backs it up and the data that backs it up, then we're perfectly willing to sort of use a third party for those sorts of things." So we think there's definitely, firms with 50 or 100 PhDs will mostly want raw data sets, but there are definitely exceptions to that. The mid-sized firms might want both, but will be more interested potentially in signal data sets. And visualization is something that's very interesting. I mean, obviously, on the fundamental and discretionary side, most of those teams might not have the data science backup to be able to create signals in a systematic way, but they might still want to gain insight from alternative data sources. So to that end, we actually launched a new product called Extract Alpha Insight. Okay. This is brand new, and it really has two modules, and we think that there are two ways in which portfolio managers and analysts might use alternative data. We've designed the product accordingly. So we have one module that's ticker analytics. So let's suppose you're an analyst and you cover one particular sector. You want to drill down into, say, what signals are saying, but more interestingly, what's the raw data saying about that name? So, and we've done this especially in the ESG space. So we have a lot of interesting data points on ESG, and analysts can go in and really dig into the details of what's driving a company's ESG scores, let's say, and understand the run-ins with regulators, some of their innovation metrics, some of their political involvement, things like this, and really get to the details. And we've actually had some sell-side groups use this tool as well. So it could be potentially useful for sell-side research as well as buy-side research. So that's ticker analytics. And then for the portfolio manager workflow, slightly different. We built something around, it's called watch list analytics. So if you have a portfolio or watch list or universe you care about, then you can track your portfolio's exposure to some of these things and potentially time your trades better. And we've shown that you can use some of these data sets to time your trades better. So those use cases on the fundamental side are interesting. There's sort of an analyst use case and a portfolio manager use case. And we think that both are interesting. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I think there's potentially room for funds to use all three: raw data, process data, and visualizations.
When you go back to your comment about signals, we hear a lot of time that funds want to see what's behind the signals, so that they can get comfortable, putting investments based on that signal. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why producing signals and consuming signals is not for everyone. There are certainly funds who will say, well, if it's a signal and it's not invented here, we're not going to use it. And that's fine. They might view that process as their in-house proprietary process. So I think a lot of it comes down to two things. One is transparency, providing, if not data transparency. So data transparency is one way to do that. Here's the underlying data, or at least some derivative of it that underpins the signal. The other way to do it is to be transparent about your process in getting to the signal. And this means being very clear about your data collection process, your analytics process, what sort of testing you did to come up with that signal, and whether you were rigorous with that. Did you use proper in-sample and out-of-sample testing? What was your universe, and so on? Did you take into account practical considerations like transaction costs? We obviously have an engine for doing all these things, but those are sort of necessary, if not sufficient, for having a signal be consumed by a fund management company. So, yeah, there is definitely a demand for transparency among signals at some level.
There's hundreds of data vendors already out there in the market. What's your advice to a data vendor that was starting to sell into the buy side in terms of data delivery format? Would you, there's three formats we've mentioned, would you say try and do them all or start with one? What are your thoughts?
I would say that if you don't have a background in creating alpha signals, don't create alpha signals. I mean, that happens to be our background. I think we're pretty good at it. But if you've got raw data that's interesting, you will find an audience for it, and many people might not like the way you create signals. We certainly, even as experienced signal creators, we find people who object to it. So I would say skip the signals. Raw data is always interesting. Visualizations are great if you think that the data lends itself to visualization, and I think many data sets do. If you think you have a good way of presenting it to people in a visual way, it'll appeal to certain fund managers on the discretionary side. If you're aiming for quants, they won't care.
And when you think about the discretionary professionals, clearly they don't want 1,000 logins to 1,000 visualization tools.
Sure.
One of the things Eagle Alpha is trying to do is produce a single dashboard interface on top of multiple alternative data sets. So I think vendors could invest a lot of time in that and actually not get much return. Is that
That's right.
your view?
I think it's possible. I mean, I think the best thing to do with all these things is to experiment before sort of diving too deeply. And you can experiment with different ways to visualize, do it at a low cost, try it with your friendly fund manager friends, or redistribute through a partner like yourselves. So there are multiple different ways to go about solving that problem.